everyone, this is Carlos Garrido from Midwestern Marx. Today I want to talk to you about dialectics, specifically the law of the interpenetration of opposites. And I want to give you an example with the concept of identity, or what can be called the paradox of identity. Say that there's a given thing A. In order for me to understand identity in A, in order for me to understand what A is, I need to juxtapose it with itself. This is an identity proposition. A equals A. It seems pretty simple. But what happens when we put A equal to A is that we split A up into two. A went from being a unity to falling into two-ness. It has fallen into duplicity. A has turned, in essence, into something other than itself in order to then juxtapose itself to itself and create this identity. This process, for Hegel, is included in all things. All things, in order to establish themselves, they need to go through a process of self-otherization. From inside themselves, they need to posit their opposite. They need to face their opposites. They need to take the risk to face their opposite. And only in taking that risk, can they come back and then establish themselves as an identity. Identity can never exist purely, right? He starts his science of logic with the concept of pure being, and he sees that it is fundamentally indistinguishable from nothingness. In order for being to be, it needs to be in a state of becoming, which means it needs to oscillate, it needs to go back and forth between two opposites, being and nothingness. So what we find in the proposition A equals A is that in order for there to be identity, there needs to already be disidentity. There needs to be the opposite of identity. There needs to be separation. There needs to be, in order to find unity, there needs to be disunity. And Hegel finds that this generally is a structure all over the place, right? One of the central sentences in the phenomenology of spirit, which in my belief, if you crack that sentence, you capture the essence of the book, is that truth is fundamentally that substance is subject. Philosophy has always ascribed some pure or pluralistic conception to what substance is, and it has searched everywhere for what substance is in order to then, according to that definition, say, here's truth. What Hegel says is that when you find that substance in that purity, you are finding absolutely nothingness. Substance always exists incorporated into the world. There's a concept in German that Hegel uses and switches up from its traditional meaning, which is Begriff. And this concept of Begriff, which refers to concept, it is never just this abstract concept. In German, it even has a etymology that's tied to gripping something, right? So the concept, something which is naturally abstract, in order for it to exist, and the concept that Hegel uses for concept is Begriff. In order for it to exist, it needs to exist concretely. It needs to be gripped in reality. So in the process of identity, in order for a thing to establish itself as itself, it needs to self-otherize itself. It needs to interpenetrate with its opposite. It needs to face its opposite, turn into its opposite, in order to then go back into itself and establish itself as itself. So this process, it's important to note, is internal, right? That's why its critique is immanent. It comes from inside. This isn't something outside that is coming into conflict with it and then establishing an opposition, right? Those diagrams that are usually tossed out for dialectics, with there's a thesis, an antithesis, synthesis, toss that out, right? Those diagrams, those diagrams, what they help you do is think about opposition in a wrong way. They make you think about opposition as two things, two separate things, two reified things that are opposed to each other, and then that they clash and make something new. Opposition in dialectics is not something that comes from outside, it's something that comes from within, something that is immanent. So, in essence, if I have a certain identity X and I want to get beyond X, the answer for that going beyond is not something that's outside. It's something that's already given to you by X. X already gives you its opposition to go beyond it. So bringing it back to the concrete, to the political, to the historical, capitalism doesn't come into existence if it doesn't also at the same time posit its self-otherization. If capitalism does not bring about its opposition in the form of the proletariat, it cannot come into existence. So the difference between the utopian socialists, which sought to escape capitalism and the wretchedness of its effects, which then their goal was to create something outside that could challenge it. The difference between that approach, which is undialectical, and a scientific understanding, a scientific socialist understanding, which emerges in Marxism and which is dialectical, is that Marx, because of the influence of Hegel, realizes that within capitalism itself is its own destruction. And it's a part of understanding what is that thing which it self-otherizes itself into that gives you the power to go beyond it, right? To sublate it, to cancel it in a way that you elevate it, sustain a part of it, but are at a fundamentally new qualitative stage. And what Marx found was that that was the proletariat. The proletariat is the most important thing for capital, but at the same time is the thing which threatens it the most. Because in order for capital to identify itself as capital, it needs to self-otherize itself and create the proletariat. And it can continue identifying itself insofar as it can continue oscillating between the proletariat and capital. But insofar as the proletariat revolts and goes beyond capital, insofar as we use that self-otherization, that opposite, to go beyond it, and we treat it eminently, that's how that identity can ultimately be destroyed. Capitalism can only be destroyed through the proletariat, or in the cases of imperialist forms of capital in countries where what exists is a peasantry and the contradiction is different. You have a contradiction between a peasantry and an imperial capitalism, a financial capitalism. Whatever that element of self-otherization is, which in our industrially developed countries is the proletariat, that element is the internal contradiction that the system produces, and it is through that element through which we can go beyond it. We can't go beyond it by postulating something from outside. We go beyond it from within it because it itself gives us the tools to go beyond it. And Marx is not pulling this from the ether. He's getting this from Hegel and from Hegel's logic and from Hegel's understanding that in order for something to be, in order for being to even be, it needs to be in a condition of oscillation, of going back and forth, of self-otherizing itself into nothingness so that it can exist in that medium of self-otherization, which he calls becoming. So, thank you. This is Carlos Garrido. I hope that wasn't too in the clouds because it's really fundamental to understanding how it is that we go beyond capitalism, how it is that we should do critique as Marxists, because critique should always be eminent. It should always be from inside because everything gives us already from an understanding of it, its own opposition. And in order to get through X, in order to get beyond X, you can only get beyond X by going through X, because X itself gives us the root and the tools to go beyond it. So thank you. This is Carlos Garrido with Midwestern Marx, signing off.